You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and this is episode 10. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, we continue to part 3 of the Instrument Airman Certification Standards. So I'm a flight examiner, and I'm going through the ACS documents one by one. We did Private Pilot on our first series, so if you haven't listened to that one, go back a few shows and listen to, I think that was a 4-part series. Then I started on the Instrument ACS, and I'm finishing up the Instrument ACS with Area of Operation 6. So we're going to talk about Area of Operation 6, 7, and 8, and that will finish up this ACS. And then I'll probably do some standalone shows that give some amplifying remarks to taking your instrument check ride. So what I'm trying to do with these podcasts and videos, if you're watching on YouTube, is give you kind of an insider view of, or the view of a check ride from a flight examiner. So it'll give you more confidence and help relieve some of those unknowns when you're going into a check ride. Because for most people, the instrument check ride is only the second time you've taken an FAA check ride. And they can be stressful events. So I think knowing more about what to expect, especially from a flight examiner's view or a DPE's point of view, is going to help you have that confidence and do a better job when you go into your check ride. And that's the real goal. Whether you're taking a check ride with me or somebody else, I want you to do well. I want to see people be successful on their aviation journey. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. So that's enough pontificating. We're going to get straight to the meat of the material, which is the Area of Operation 6. And this is where we're starting our instrument approaches. So this is kind of the real, I guess, meat of the Instrument Airman Certification Standards, or the instrument check ride, are these approaches that we're doing. So during your instrument training, it started out with just learning the basics of instrument flight. And we talked about that on the last episode, where you're going to have to demonstrate proficiency in just basic instrument flying, which is just flying the airplane at a fixed altitude, bank angles, or climbs by sole reference to the instruments. But the real goal of that is to put it all together and be able to fly an approach, either precision or non-precision, down to minimums or your MDA or your decision altitude, and land the airplane. That's the real goal of flying instruments, right? So that's what we're doing in Area of Operation 6, is our instrument approach procedures. In Area of Operation 6, Task A is our non-precision approach. So you can see the ACS document is kind of reversed here compared to what we were seeing during the oral exam, or that Area of Operation 1, which is really what I'm using to ask the questions on the ground, where you had a lot of knowledge items, a lot of risk management items, and not a lot of skills. Well, here on the non-precision approach task, we only have 4 knowledge items, we have 7 risk management items, and we have, I believe, 14 skill areas to demonstrate. So I'm going to try to do a better job of highlighting what I'm talking about. So first of all, we have our 4 knowledge items, K1 through K4. So the knowledge items, we're going to cover some of this in the oral, or we will have already covered some of this in the oral exam when I have you analyze one of the approach procedures, which is generally something that we do on the ground. When we get in the plane, though, I'm going to wind up observing you display or demonstrate knowledge in these areas while you're in the course of doing the instrument approach, because you're going to have to pull out that instrument approach procedure, be it on your iPad or a printed version, and you're going to have to correctly analyze it, tune in frequencies and bug courses and several different items here, and you're going to demonstrate these knowledge items here. So that's the knowledge items that we're doing. The next is the risk management. Like I said, we have 7 of those right there. If you're following along on YouTube, you can see that. So, but if you're just listening, it's not a big deal. You can listen along. So the risk management items, we have 7 of those. And again, both knowledge and risk management, as an examiner, the ACS says I have to observe you demonstrate proficiency in at least one of the knowledge in one of the risk management areas. So there's 7 risk management areas. We'll wind up probably observing at least 2 or 3 of those at a minimum throughout the course of the check ride, but I only have to do one. I'm not going to read those individually. These are getting a little bit longer, so I don't want to be real wordy. I'm going to try to focus in on the ones that I think are most important. All right, so those are our 7 risk management items. And now we get to the all-important skills. So we have 14 skills. So like I've said before, we have to demonstrate proficiency in every single one of the skills that the ACS talks about. So I am going to kind of go blow by blow through these and how that's going to look on an instrument approach, specifically the non-precision instrument approach. So skill 1, we want to accomplish an instrument approach selected by the examiner, okay? Establish two-way communication with ATC for the phase of flight. That's going to be done in a non-radar environment or a non-ATC environment. That's going to be simulated. So you're going to simulate establishing two-way communication with me as the examiner. I'm going to be sitting in the right seat, and you're just going to say over intercom, 677 Quebec requests vectors for the RNAV runway 25 into Russellville. That would be kind of a simulated radio call you'd make in a normal radar environment, but since we're operating outside a radar environment, we're going to simulate doing that. Now, if you're in Dallas and you're under Class Bravo, or you're in Class Bravo and you're talking to regional approach, you're actually going to do that. So there's no reason to simulate it because we have an actual radar environment. So in that case, you're just going to actually do it. Select a tune, identify, and confirm operational status of navigation equipment. So in this case, we would, if it's going to be an RNAV approach, which we're going to talk about whether or not these have to be RNAV or traditional or ground-based nav aids here in a little bit. But if it's an RNAV, we're going to plug it in and make sure that our GPS is telling us that we have LNAV capability, and that we don't have any, really, it usually shows up as an LOI, I guess, a low probability of, or a high probability of error, or some sort of caution that you'd be on your GPS unit saying that, hey, you don't have enough GPS satellite coverage to successfully do this approach. So we're looking for the proper terminology there, the LNAV plus V, something like that. If we're doing a ground-based nav aid, we're going to listen to it. We're going to listen to its Morse code identifier. We're going to make sure we don't have any flags in our CDI, and that all the instruments required for this approach are operating, and we verified they're operational. For skill 4, we're going to comply with clearances issued by ATC or the evaluator. So there again, if you're under ATC control, of course, you're going to follow ATC's direction. If you're not under ATC control, you're going to listen to what the evaluator says, kind of building their simulated ATC environment. Recognize if any flight instruments is inaccurate, inoperative, and take appropriate action. Okay, so if you do see an error flag, okay, did I get a frequency wrong? Did I miss a NOTAM? Is this localizer not operating? Maybe I would ask ATC, hey, request status of the localizer at North Little Rock because I'm not receiving it. So are you going to ask that question? More than likely you did something wrong. So double check your work here. Make sure you got the frequencies. Make sure you selected the correct approach. Make sure you're not getting down the road of mode confusion where you're trying to do a localizer, but you failed to change your CDI source from RNAV to VLOC. That's a real common error here. So you need to be cognizant of that. Advise ATC or the evaluator if unable to comply with the clearance. Okay, so I don't typically do this as a habit where I'll give you something you can't comply with. But occasionally, or I do like to see a student or an applicant do that. If I'm giving them extremely short vectors or a vector that doesn't make sense, or maybe I give them an altitude that's a couple hundred feet below the MSA for the approach plate. I do like to see the applicant say, hey, confirm you want me at 2200 because I'm seeing MSA is 2400. So that's a great situational awareness thing. And it's also important to know that that controllers are not infallible. And that's kind of what this is getting down, is ATC may ask you to do things that you just really can't do, or probably is not in the best interest of safety if you do that. So make sure you're following along there. I'm going to try to highlight these as I go along. All right. Skill 7, complete the appropriate checklist. Okay, so are you using checklists? Are you using a flow? That's typically what I teach in the school here, is use a flow and back it up with a checklist when time permits, when you're airborne. When you're on the ground, you need to be using a checklist basically for every phase on the ground, because there's no excuse not to be able to pull out a checklist and go through it. When you're in the air, especially single pilot IFR, I've said this before, it's one of the hardest things you can do in aviation. So I'm a big advocate of running a flow when you're busy and kind of the task load is high. And then when you're established and everything's stable, then pull out a checklist and review it, make sure that you've accomplished it when time permits. But the appropriate time to pull out a checklist is probably not when you're crossing the final approach fix. There's a lot of stuff going on there that is more important than you running that checklist. You need to get the plane configured. You need to verify that you have the instrument approach loaded correctly, and there's several things that a checklist would really help with, but it's not the time to pull out and run that checklist. So give yourself the ability to do a flow, which is kind of a hockey stick flow or left to right. If you don't know what flows are, maybe I need to do a podcast on that. But there's definitely some videos on YouTube you can see of people doing flows, and that's what the professional aviation folks are using, is that flow-based. And then when it's appropriate to run a checklist, single pilot, run that checklist. So that's task 7. Task 8, establish the appropriate airplane configuration and airspeed considering meteorological and operating conditions. So the configuration piece, that's a really good thing to talk about. I typically like to see the airplane configured for landing at the final approach fix. It doesn't have to be your final configuration. And if you're, this took a little bit for me to think about and establish, coming from the Air Force side of things, where we had to be in a landing configuration at the final approach fix. Well, that's in a big 4-engine turboprop airplane that has plenty of excess energy, kind of a Boeing or Airbus type airline event. You'd have to be configured for your final configuration for landing at the final approach fix as well, or something very close to that. In general aviation, it's probably not the best idea to be at your final configuration at the final approach fix, because we're kind of low on energy. So what I mean by that, let's say you're flying a Cessna 172. Your gear is down already, so you don't have to worry about that piece. You're kind of always in a landing configuration in a fixed gear aircraft, but you're never going to land, or you shouldn't be planning to land with no flaps. So what I would expect as a appropriate configuration on the final approach fix is maybe 15 degrees or 20 degrees of flaps at the final approach fix, and slow down to somewhere around 100 knots, maybe 90 knots, something like that. I wouldn't expect, and I don't think it's the best idea to go to full flaps and slow to your threshold speed or your final approach speed in a 172. So that would look more like going full flaps, either 30 or 40 degrees of flaps, and slowing the airplane to 70, 68 knots, depending on what version of the 172 you're flying. I don't think that's the best way to fly the approach. Now, that is very stable. It's going to take us quite a bit of time to get from the final approach fix to landing. But if you were to experience any type of engine failure in that configuration, you're really not setting yourself up for success. So you've got full flaps in. You're going to have to retract those, to get the best configuration for best glide. And I just don't think it's the best idea. Also, if you're at an airport that's busy at all, flying 70 knots down the final approach course is probably not the most convenient thing in a mixed traffic environment where you have turboprops and jets and just faster pistons coming in. You're probably not making ATC, you're not making their life any easier, I'll put it that way. So probably not the best idea to configure your final configuration there on a long final prior to the final approach fix. If you're on a retractable gear aircraft, like in our multi-school, we teach this, where you're going to get the gear down and you're going to get about 15 degrees of flaps in. and you're going to fly about 120 knots. That's what we're going for. Now, that is not our final landing configuration, which is going to be full flaps and 100 miles an hour. That's what we're crossing the numbers at, basically. We're not going to fly that all the way down final approach course, and that's not what I'm looking for as an examiner, but I am looking for some sort of landing configuration, which means gear down and some appropriate amount of flaps. So that's skill 8. Skill 9, maintain plus or minus 100 feet, selected heading plus or minus 10 degrees, airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and accurately track radials, courses, bearings prior to beginning the final approach segment. So that should sound familiar. That plus or minus 100, plus or minus 10, plus or minus 10 for the knots. That's what we've been using for our instrument work earlier in the check ride and just basic instrument flying. That's what we're going to continue to use on the non-precision approach. All right, skill 10. It is adjusting, trying to get this highlighted there. Adjust the published MDA and visibility criteria for the aircraft approach category as appropriate for factors that include NOTAMs, inoperative aircraft or navigational equipment, or inoperative visual aids associated with the landing environment, etc. All right, so a couple things we're covering here. We have the published MDA. Often the published MDA is going to be revised by one of those things it's talking about, either NOTAMs, inoperative aircraft equipment, or navigational equipment, or inoperative visual aids, mainly lights. And there's an inoperative table in the digital instrument procedures supplement. You can find that in ForeFlight. I am going to do an episode on how to configure ForeFlight for your instrument approach and some of the stuff that you need to have saved. I think that's really important. And one of the downsides to moving to digital publications on like an electronic flight bag is that the old style instrument approach, we call them instrument approach plates, that book, that big thick book that had all the instrument procedures for a given region. In the front cover of that, it had the all the legend material and all the alternate takeoff minimums, and everything was in that one plate. So if you had that plate book for the Arkansas region, you had everything you needed for instrument approaches in Arkansas. Now, if you have your iPad, you have that as well, but it's not in the same location. You have to kind of look around in ForeFlight to find some of this stuff. So that's one of the downsides of having ForeFlight, and something that I think I need to do. Maybe even the next show is how to configure the iPad for that. So if you have inoperative lighting, so let's say the approach lighting system that the instrument approach is based off of is inoperative, that may change the visibility requirements. So do you have that marked on there, and have you made the changes appropriately? It's real common for there to be an obstacle because of construction at a town that you're flying in. And so that construction, maybe there's a crane, and that crane has forced the increase of the MDA, and that's communicated to you, the pilot, through a NOTAM. And so did you update your instrument approach plate with that revised MDA because of that NOTAM there? So that's what we're looking for there. S11, that's skill 11, establish a stabilized descent to the final approach, or the appropriate altitude. So establishing a stabilized descent to the appropriate altitude. Stabilized is very clearly defined in Part 121 world, or the Air Force world, where you have stabilized approach criteria. Stabilized approach is going to change depending on the aircraft that you're flying on the instrument check ride. But big picture wise, what we're looking for is, I'm generally looking for something less than 1,000 feet per minute and less briefed. The reason I say that is this is a non-precision approach. There are some non-precision circling approaches that, depending on the speed that you're flying, might require higher than 1,000 foot a minute descent inside the final approach fix to get down to MDA. That's something that should be briefed. Anytime you're flying more than 1,000 feet a minute on final approach, that needs to be briefed completely, 100%. You need to have a good reason why you're doing that. So stabilized approach, typically looking for 500 to 400 to 700 feet a minute. It kind of depends on the wind consideration, the ground speed of the aircraft, the type of approach being flown. Is it a circling approach? Is it just a non-precision LNAV plus V? That may look a lot more like an ILS, where I've got 400 to 500 foot a minute descent, and I'm flying that at my appropriate approach speed, and it's nice and stable and smooth down to the appropriate altitude, be it an intermediate fix altitude, like a step-down fix, or be it the MDA of that approach. Okay, so that's S11. S12, for the final approach segment, so we finally made it to final approach segment here. Boy, it's not letting me highlight very well. All right, so for the final approach segment, maintain no more than 3/4 scale deflection of the CDI, maintain airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and altitude, if appropriate, above MDA plus 100 minus 0 to the VDP, or the visual descent point, or missed approach point, MAP. All right, so let's kind of parse this out. First of all, 3/4 scale deflection of the CDI. That is your tolerance. Now, remember, we talked about this in private pilot. I think I've talked about it in this show, but if you do go beyond 3/4 scale momentarily and you correct back, the ACS does allow for that. So if you bust 3/4 scale deflection, that doesn't mean an automatic failure. The ACS talks about how consistently exceeding tolerances is grounds for failure. And so that tells me that not consistently exceeding them is not grounds for failure. So consistently is kind of a subjective word. So if once or twice you exceed the 3/4 scale deflection, but you immediately recognize and correct, let's say you didn't correct for winds as well as you should have, and you kind of go beyond that and you're trying to take small corrections, but it's not enough, and you wind up going almost full scale deflection, but we still have a deflection, and you immediately correct back, that's not grounds for failure. In my mind, you're still showing that, hey, you didn't do a great job, but you recognized and corrected. And that's a really important skill to have as an aviator, and that's great for me to see that you have that skill as an examiner. Now, if we're coming down and it's constantly, full scale deflection left and right, then yeah, that's going to be grounds for failure. You need to be able to hold it consistently within 3/4 scale deflection of the CDI. If you're not able to do that, we need to go back and do some additional training. So that's the scale deflection, plus or minus 10 knots, and the altitude, if appropriate, plus 100 minus 0. So maybe use that one to your advantage, and instead of going right down to MDA, maybe add a 50-foot buffer and say, I'm going to level off at MDA plus 50, and that's well within the tolerances, and it's also because you have a minus 0. You can't go below MDA. And then you're going to hold MDA until the VDP or MAP. So the visual descent point, more and more approaches are having VDPs calculated, and they're displayed on there. You don't have to go around at the VDP. You could level off at the MDA, continue to drive that in until you reach your missed approach point, which is typically the end of the runway for a non-precision approach. Could be something else, but the appropriate missed approach point, that's when you need to go around. And this is something that, is probably not grounds for failure, but we will have a debrief point if you reach MDA and I tell you runway not in sight, and then you immediately go around. Well, if we were doing the dive and drive method, which is to dive down to MDA as not fast as possible, but get down to MDA relatively quickly, let's say at 700 or 800 feet a minute, and then drive in towards the missed approach point. We want to drive all the way to the missed approach point because potentially we could pick up the runway environment the closer we get to it, right? And if we go around as soon as we get to the MDA, we might be going around, 3 or 4 miles prior to the airport, even outside of the circling radius. So the dive and drive may not be the most stable thing, but in some cases that's the best way to get below the clouds, and it all depends on the simulated weather scenario that you have or the type of approach that you're flying. Definitely, if we're flying a circling approach and we reach MDA, and I tell you runway's not in sight, and you immediately go around, that's probably not the right thing to do. You probably needed to drive that into the MDA or the MAP, and then make your decision to go around at the MAP if you don't have it in sight. So that's enough about the MAP and VDP. All right, execute a missed approach procedure if required. Visual references are not distinctly visible and identifiable appropriate point or altitude to the approach profile, or execute a normal landing from a straight in or circling approach. Sorry, I kind of stumbled on my words there, still trying to figure out this highlighting thing. So execute a missed approach if required, so or land the airplane. So this is probably, 100% of the time. I'll go ahead and go out on a limb and say 100% of the time this is going to be simulated, because I think I've mentioned this, but we're not going to fly this check ride in actual instrument conditions. So anytime that you're forced to go around on an instrument check ride, it's going to be because of simulated conditions, because we're only doing this check ride in visual conditions, with few exceptions, honestly. So this instrument approach, you're going to have the view limiting device on, a hood or foggles or whatever you're using. You're going to be at MDA or your VDP, and this is something that we'll brief prior to the check ride, or you'll brief prior to the check ride with your examiner, is who's going to call my go-around. Are you going to say field not in sight, or am I going to say, hey, do I have the field in sight? And I'll say, no, you don't have the field in sight, and then you can make the decision to go around. Or I'll say, yeah, you have the field in sight, go ahead and circle to land, or fly straight in, depending on what the approach is. So that's the option there for skill 13. Skill 14, this is our last one. Use an MFD or other graphical navigation displays, if installed, to monitor, position, track, wind drift, and maintain situational awareness. So use an MFD or other graphical, that could be just a traditional HSI. Could be an MFD. That's more and more common in aircraft, as simple as a G5 or 275 or a G1000, whatever it is, or just a traditional HSI or CDI, and it just says if installed. So that's not required. It's only required if it's installed in the aircraft. So you're going to use that MFD to fly down. And remember, the MFD, I said G5, that doesn't count as an MFD. A multifunction display is more like the right screen of a G1000, so something we typically call the moving map. So it could be a 430 or 750, where we're using that moving map, that magenta line with a little airplane symbology. We're using that to back up our primary flight display, which is our CDI. So I kind of misspoke there. We weren't talking about our PFD, but our MFD. So you could have an HSI, just a traditional HSI, or even a G5 with even just a little 430 screen with the moving map up. That counts as a type of MFD. So are you using that appropriately? A big one on skill 14, I'll just talk about it a little bit more, is the over-reliance on the MFD. And this is something that I will do personally on my check rides, is I will make sure I turn the MFD to a non-moving map page. So in other words, on the 750, I might just pull up the menu feature, take your moving map away from you, and make sure on one of these approaches you can just use raw navigational data, your CDI or HSI, to fly the approach, and that you're not completely reliant on that magenta line with little airplane symbology. The reason is that can be a very dangerous thing to be relying on, because if you have the zoom set out too far, you can see that your airplane seems to be established on the magenta line, but if you're just flying off of that, you might be, several hundred yards, if not up to a mile or two off course, and you can't tell because you're zoomed out really far. There's been a couple of accidents where this is speculated to be the case, where somebody crashes into terrain exactly parallel to the course that they were flying. And so you got the inbound course. So if they were using a CDI, which is making sure that they're established within the protected airspace, you would have been fine. They seem to be using the moving map, so they were about a mile right of course, exactly parallel to it, and then hit a mountain that's over there, or terrain, or an object. So that's something that's important for us to evaluate. All right, now we're on to task B, which is the precision approach. We're at 30 minutes already. I'm going to try to go through this as fast as possible, but if you haven't noticed, my podcasts are a little bit longer. YouTube videos definitely longer than normal, but I want you to really get a lot out of this in preparation for your check ride. So hopefully you're taking the time to listen to this. Anyway, our precision approach is task B, very similar to the non-precision approach. We have 4 knowledge areas, so they're listed right there, K1 through K4. We have 7 risk management areas. Again, they're very similar to the risk management and knowledge areas of the non-precision approach. So those are very similar. And then I think we have 2 pages. Yeah, we have 16 skills. This is one of the few ACS tasks that is a 2-page. They tried to fit all the tasks on 1 page, but there's very few throughout the entire ACS documentation from private through ATP that stretch across 2 pages. This is one of them, the precision approach. So we've got 16 skills to go through here. So let's start with skill 1. So accomplish precision instrument approaches selected by the evaluator. Not going to talk much about that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Skill 2, establish two-way communication with ATC for the appropriate phase. Again, we're exactly the same as the previous tasks, so not going to talk much more about that. Skill 3, select, tune, identify, and confirm operational navigational equipment for the aircraft. Again, not going to talk much about this, except on the GPS, you're looking for LPV. Now, we're going to talk about Appendix 7 because I know there's some of you saying, well, Seth, our nav approaches are never precision approaches. Well, that most GA airplanes can fly. They're not precision approaches. So you are correct. An LPV approach is not legally a precision approach. But the appendix of the ACS actually allows us to use certain LPV approaches to count as a precision approach task. So correctly identifying that you have LPV capability for that approach may be required. And we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. Skill 4, comply with clearances issued by ATC. Got it. We're not going to talk much about that. Skill 5, recognize flight instrumentation is inaccurate, inoperative, and then take appropriate action. Not too worried about that one. That's the same thing that we talked about in the non-precision. Advise ATC if unable to comply. Got it. Skill 7, complete the appropriate checklist. I'm not going to rehash that. I already talked about it. Skill 8, establish appropriate airplane configuration and airspeed considering turbulence and wind shear. All right, so that was not talked about on the non-precision approach. So if we do have wind shear, and wind shear is, again, we're doing this in VFR conditions, so the incidence of having wind shear during an instrument check ride is pretty low, but we might have wind gusts. That's real common. So what I expect, or what's kind of common for wind gusts, is to add a percentage of the gust factor to your final approach speed to account for those gusts. And typically it's just the gust factor itself, or 50% of the gust factor. So for instance, if I'm if the winds are gusting from 5 to 10 knots, then that's a 5-knot gust factor. So I'm going to add 2.5 or 3 knots to my final approach speed. And then I'll add up to 10 knots to my approach speed. So if it's gusting 15 knots, I'm not going to add more than 10 knots to that, if that makes sense. But again, we're doing this in VFR conditions, so it's not very common to have just horrible weather like that for wind shear and turbulence. All right, skill 9, maintain altitude plus or minus 100 feet, the heading plus or minus 10 knots, or 10 degrees, airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and accurately track radials courses prior to beginning the final approach segment. No different than the precision approach, so we're not going to spend any more time on that. Skill 10, adjust the published DA, DH, and visibility criteria for the aircraft approach category as appropriate to account for NOTAMs, inoperative equipment, navigational equipment, or inoperative visual aids associated with the landing environment. Almost identical to the non-precision approach skill, except it's adjusting our decision altitude or decision height. So that's a little bit different than our MDA. All right, skill 11, establish a predetermined rate of descent at the point where vertical guidance begins, which approximates that required for the airplane to follow the vertical guidance. So this is very important, is to have an idea. It doesn't have to be exact, but have an idea of what is my vertical speed required to track this vertical guidance down in the given conditions. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're flying an approach where you have a slight tailwind. Your rate of descent on to track that glide slope down is a function of your ground speed. So the higher your ground speed, the higher your rate of descent is going to need to be. Your ground speed is directly affected by the wind speed at altitude. So if you have a tailwind, you're going to need a higher rate of descent than if you were shooting an approach with a headwind. Now, generally speaking, we're going to try to choose an approach that has the most favorable wind. However, during a check ride, just for the sake of time, we do want to be cognizant of the amount of time we're spending airborne. I don't want to make the check ride extremely long. So we're generally going to do this at either one or two local airports. So we're necessarily going to be limited in the amount of approaches we have available to us, which might mean that we need to shoot an instrument approach or a precision approach with a slight tailwind. So you need to be able to account for that and say, okay, well, instead of my normal 450 foot a minute descent that I need for this airplane typically, I'm going to need about 650 feet a minute descent to account for this tailwind. So that's a skill that you need to be able to demonstrate. Skill 12, maintain a stabilized final approach from the FAF to the decision altitude or decision height, no more than 3/4 scale deflection of either the vertical or lateral guidance, and maintain the desired airspeed of plus or minus 10 knots. So now we're looking for 3/4 scale deflection for both horizontal and vertical guidance, or lateral guidance and vertical guidance. And the same thing that I talked about on the previous task of the non-precision approach. If you go beyond that 3/4 scale deflection, doesn't mean an automatic failure. So don't stress if that happens. So if you do get more than 3/4 scale deflection, that is not the end of the world. Again, the ACS isn't looking for perfection here. It's looking for not consistently exceeding tolerances. So let's talk about if you do. What happens if you do get full scale deflection? What does that mean? Does that mean an automatic failure? My answer to that is not necessarily. If you get full scale deflection, I'm very interested to see what you're going to do, and that could lead us down the path of a disapproval. But if in the real world you get full scale deflection, what are you going to do? Well, the correct answer is you're going to notify air traffic control and you're going to execute a missed approach because you're unstable. You can't verify the position of your aircraft. So you're going to go missed approach. And that's if you get lateral full-scale deflection. If you get vertical full-scale deflection, let's talk about that. That could be different. If you're high on glide slope to the point, let's say you're shooting an ILS, and at the final approach fix, you get distracted, you maintain level altitude, and you wind up getting full-scale deflection above the glide slope. You got a decision there. You could change to localizer minima for the time being and increase your rate of descent to try to capture the vertical glide slope. You could recapture it and then transition back to your ILS minima. Now, in order for that to be valid, you really need to have briefed both the localizer minima and the precision minima, the ILS minima, and then you also need to brief me that you have the plan of if you get full-scale deflection, we're going to transition to the localizer or something to that effect. For your check ride, though, and that's kind of real world, for your check ride or real world, a valid option is if you get full-scale deflection either way, is to go missed approach, especially lateral. So if we get lateral full-scale deflection, turn to a safe heading, climb to MSA, announce your intentions with ATC or the simulated ATC, which is going to be inside of our cockpit, and basically just fess up and say, hey, I really botched up this approach, request vectors back to the initial approach fix or something to that effect. If I see you do that on the check ride, that doesn't necessarily mean the automatic disapproval. That shows me that you have good aeronautical decision making, because the decision to try to save an unstable approach is often, I would almost say without exception, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but the decision to try to save a bad approach is always more dangerous than just calling the baby ugly and going around. That's what you should do. And if you do that in the check ride, then we're probably going to have we're going to discuss it. It's going to be a debriefable item, but I don't think it would necessarily result in a disapproval. Now, if we have to go missed because you're full-scale deflection more than once, then that shows a nature of consistency, and that kind of meets the letter of the law for a disapproval. So that's probably going to be a disapproval if we go full-scale deflection on either lateral or vertical more than once during the check ride. But once, there's a lot of things that could go into this, right? Distractions on the radio, other traffic in the pattern. If we're in a non-towered field and we're having to deal with other traffic that's not necessarily taking consideration and our consideration of doing a check ride in mind, there's a lot of things that could cause us to go full-scale deflection, a lot of distractions that could happen. So if you make the safe decision and go around, I'm fine with that. We're going to talk about it, but it's not necessarily disapproval. So hopefully that clears things up of what if you do get full-scale deflection. But definitely, if you get right at 3/4, maybe slide over 3/4 scale deflection, and you correct back, that's not grounds for disapproval. But if we consistently do that, then yeah, that's grounds for disapproval. So the best thing is, if you're doing all this other stuff, if you're configuring by the final approach fix, calculating a stabilized approach descent rate, if you're doing all of that, the chances of you getting beyond 3/4 scale deflection is very low. So I would definitely recommend just do all that and don't get anywhere close to 3/4 scale deflection, and we're good to go. The next one, skill 13, immediately initiate missed approach procedure when the DA or DH and the required visual reference for the runway are not unmistakably visible and identifiable. So immediately initiate the missed approach procedure when at the DA or DH. Don't wait. Now, I always give this example of or talk about the difference between an MDA and a DA and DH. Notice that in the non-precision task, it talked about plus 100 minus 0 of MDA. So we cannot go below the MDA. But it's interesting to see here that it gives us no altitude requirements for the decision altitude and decision height. So it doesn't say minus 0 below the decision altitude or decision height. The reason is, just due to physics, our plane is going to dip below decision altitude or decision height because we're reaching that altitude and then making the decision of whether or not to go around. So you're already descending at 500 feet a minute. You can't just immediately stop that rate of descent. You're going to go slightly below the decision altitude or decision height if you make the decision to go missed. And on how far you go below that altitude is kind of dependent on your rate of descent, the type of airplane you're in, whether it's underpowered or overpowered, and then your just reaction time. But you're naturally going to go below that altitude in the real world as well. And these approaches take that into account. They have protected airspace to make sure that the decision altitude is at a high enough for you to be able to make a decision there, dip below it, and not hit anything, and execute the missed approach. So I just think that that's interesting to bring up. So making that decision early and immediately. Skill 14, transition to a normal landing approach, missed approach for seaplanes, only when the airplane is in a position from which a descent to a landing on the runway can be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvering. So transition to a normal landing approach only when you're able to make a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvering. Now we'll talk about, are we going to land out of a precision approach, or are we always going to go missed approach? This just says transition to a normal landing. On skill 14. I kind of jumped around there. All right, the next one, skill 15. Maintain stable visual flight path from the DA to the or DA-DH to the runway aiming point where a normal landing may be accomplished within the touchdown zone. And then skill 16, use an MFD or other graphical navigation displays if installed to monitor position, wind drift, maintain situational awareness. Again, that's just situational awareness. We're not talking about our CDI, especially in our precision. We're going to have to use the glide slope because there's a few MFDs out there like the G1000 that have a vertical situational display, a VSD. Some of the more advanced GA aircraft will have that VSD, but we definitely don't need to be using that to fly the approach down. That's just for situational awareness. That's not for approach guidance. So notice that it didn't talk about actually completing the landing. It just said transitioning to a landing and transitioning to where a normal landing may be accomplished in the touchdown zone. So we're going to talk about that. It's amplified remarks in the appendix section on whether or not we're going to land out of this approach. All right, so that's our precision approach task. Missed approach, a little bit shorter here. We only have one knowledge item. That's kind of interesting. We'll just read through that one because we only have one. And elements related to missed approach procedures and limitations associated with the standard instrument approaches, including while using an FMS or autopilot if equipped. That's a good one, and I bring this up on every check ride that we do that in an aircraft that has an autopilot installed. I'm going to ask how a missed approach is accomplished when you're accomplishing that missed approach while using the autopilot, because each autopilot is going to be slightly different in terms of how you're going to manage the AFCS or the autopilot during the missed approach. All right, we have 5 risk management items. The last one there, that's one, failure to manage automated navigation and auto flight systems. That's one that we're going to have to cover. And then skill 1 through 10, we have 10 skills. The first one, promptly initiate missed approach procedure and report it to ATC. Okay, promptly. Doesn't give us a second, or a time frame. It just says promptly. Skill 2, apply the appropriate power setting for the flight condition and establish pitch attitude necessary to obtain desired performance. Skill 3, configure the airplane in accordance with airplane's manufacturer instructions, establish a positive rate of climb, and accelerate to the appropriate airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. Skill 4, follow the recommended checklist items appropriate to the missed approach go-round procedure. So great time for a flow right here. If you're doing the missed approach and you kind of feel like a one-man band is what I imagine, you're pressing buttons, you're moving power levers, you're verifying configurations. If you pause there to take a checklist out, you need to rethink your life. That's not a great time to pull out a checklist. That's a great time for a flow, and you really need to be doing this with your instrument flight instructor, is figure out a repeatable flow, and it needs to be a memory item, because if single pilot IFR is the hardest thing we do in general aviation, a missed approach while IMC doing single pilot IFR is the hardest thing we can do in single pilot IFR operations. So this is the hardest event for you to do. Maybe a night circling approach would be harder. It's at least more dangerous, but a single pilot real world missed approach in IMC conditions is a very challenging thing to do, and you're going to be using every brain cell possible to do it successfully and correctly, and it's just not a great time to pull out a checklist. So you need to follow the recommended checklist items, but you need to back yourself up with a checklist. Once that established, you establish a positive rate of climb, you configure the aircraft, you're at a safe altitude, that's when the checklist needs to come out, and you're going to verify that you completed all the steps. All right, skill 4. Skill 5, comply with published alternate missed approach procedures. I will do this in almost every check ride I give. We need to do one full missed approach. The rest of the time, I'm going to give you some alternate missed instructions, and that's really, honestly, just to decrease the amount of time we have to spend doing this check ride. I'm using our time wisely. I also want to make sure that you can comply with alternate missed instructions, is because that's a very common thing to get in real world IFR flying, is to get alternate missed approach instructions. Skill 6, advise ATC or the evaluator if unable to comply. with restrictions or climb gradient. It's interesting that it mentioned climb gradient there. So if I give you, maintain 700 feet a minute climb rate, you need to advise me if you can't do that. Also, in some missed approach procedures, it might dictate, especially if it's at an airport that has an obstacle departure procedure, an ODP, it may have published climb gradients for the missed approach, and if you can't comply with those, you probably need to identify that prior to completing the approach, and then not do the approach if you can't comply with the missed approach. But anyway, you need to notify me if you can't comply with anything. Skill 7, maintain heading, course, or bearing plus or minus 10 degrees at altitude plus or minus 100 feet during the missed approach procedure. Okay, pretty straightforward there. Skill 8, use an MFD or graphical displays if installed to monitor position and help navigate the missed approach. Got it? We talked about that already. Skill 9, demonstrate SRM or CRM as appropriate. This is what I was talking about by using a flow. Single pilot resource management or crew resource management is really critical during the missed approach procedure. I would say 99.9% of the time I'm giving the instrument checkride in a single pilot environment, and so I expect you to demonstrate SRM. A skill of SRM is using flows and using checklists when appropriate. So, for instance, poor SRM would be total reliance on a checklist to successfully complete a missed approach. So we reach the MDA. I tell you, runway not in sight. We reach the MAP. You say, all right, going around. You pull out a checklist. Step 1, full power. Okay, and then announce. All right. This whole time we're not flying the airplane. We're running a checklist. So that's poor SRM, right? The appropriate action would be, okay, I'm going to run this flow. Whatever it is appropriate for my airplane, but big picture, I want to get power in. I want to get a positive rate of climb established. I want to deconfigure the airplane if appropriate, when appropriate. So once I have the positive rate of climb set, I'm probably going to go flaps, gear, flaps. So if I had full flaps in, I'm going to retract those to a intermediate position if appropriate. I might retract all of them. Once the flaps are retracted, I've got rid of all that drag. Now I'm going to get the gear up. Once the gear's up, I need to adjust trim to account for that change of trim pressures there. I need to reconfigure my flight director as appropriate, because if I have a go-around button, that go-around button isn't giving me lateral guidance. It's just giving me wings level and a pitch attitude. So now if I press the go-around button, I need to select a heading mode, or navigation mode, and a pitch mode if required, if that's installed on your aircraft. The next thing I need to do is choose an appropriate navigation source, and that might need to happen before I choose the flight director source. It just kind of depends on your flow there. But if I was doing a ground-based navigation, I need to switch over to my RNAV navigation if I'm going to use that for my missed approach. If I was using a ground-based nav aid for the final approach like a localizer, the missed approach might be defined off of a VOR, so I need to switch to a different CDI source or a different HSI. So there's a lot of different things that are happening right here. It's to me, it's one of the highest stress things you can do single pilot IFR. That's just my opinion. I'm not saying that's, I don't have any data really to back that up, unfortunately. But that, in my opinion, one of the most difficult things you can do, and you really need to be making use of SRM. All right, skill 10. Request ATC clearance to attempt another approach, proceed to the alternate airport, holding fix, or other clearance limit as appropriate or as directed by the evaluator. So this is a good one. You've gone missed. Now what? Okay, we're going out. Let's say I give you alternate missed instructions. I may handle this for you because in the real world, this happened the other day. I'm holding short in the King Air. I see a Delta Airlines flight on final. A Southwest flight is on the runway. The Delta Airlines flight has already told Tower that they are a little concerned about the spacing. Tower, tells Southwest flight, no delay on clearing the runway. They don't clear in time. Delta Airlines flight has to go missed. And so Tower Tower tells them, hey, execute or climb runway heading, maintain 2000, contact regional approach, or something like that. I kind of flip over to regional approach because I'm just curious on how this conversation's going to go, because obviously the Delta guy is probably a little irritated he had to go around. Regional approach, as soon as he checks in, says, all right, turn right to, heading 360. We're going to vector you back around for an ILS. So that's kind of a real-world missed approach scenario where ATC is probably going to tell you, hey, this is what I'm planning. You just went missed. I'm going to give you these alternate vectors, and you're going to come back around for another ILS. That's if you went around because of something, somebody on the runway for spacing, for instance. If you had to go missed because you didn't break out, you're probably not going to be vectored back around to that same approach to try it again, because you just didn't break out. So why would you waste time going back in there? If it's for some other reason, maybe it's appropriate for you to go back there. So just be prepared to have a question of, hey, ATC, this is what I'd like to do. And we can kind of play that scenario game. All right, so that is that for the missed approach. Next is our circling approach. Well, again, we've got one knowledge item. So elements related to circling approach procedures, including approach categories and related airspeed restrictions. So we're going to talk about that. Some of the risk management items. Let's talk about some of these, because there's a lot of risk management involved with circling. It's one of the more dangerous things you can do, so much so that a lot of professional or certificate holders like 121 or 135 operators, they restrict circling in some ways. Sometimes they'll say no night circling is approved for our operator. You just can't do it. Or night circling is restricted to captains only. So you have to be the captain. We won't let the first officer complete the circle or circling at night. So those are just some examples of professional risk management there. But let's look at that. Losing visual contact with identifiable part of the airport. So while you're doing the circle, if you lose visual contact with the airport, what are you going to do? How are you going to handle that? Low altitude maneuvering to include stall spin or CFIT. Seems like every year we'll hear about 2 or 3 incidents involved with circling the land. I've heard Max Trescott throw out the number. I think it's like 20 times more likely to have an accident doing a night circling or something that's astronomically high. But that's because we're maneuvering at low altitudes. We're putting some G on there, some load factor on the airplane to make this turn happen low to the ground. Right after coming out of instrument conditions potentially, and we can stall the airplane, and it's dangerous. So then we have 8 skills here. So comply with procedures. I'm not going to talk much about that. Skill 2, confirm direction of traffic and adhere to all restrictions issued by ATC or the evaluator. So that I'd make a really conscious effort to give realistic circling instructions. Because again, I'm playing the role of ATC for most of my check rides. So I'll say, 677 Quebec, circle north for left base, runway 07. That's a realistic circling instruction you would get from an actual air traffic controller. So you need to be able to, and they're going to give you a cardinal direction and then a base turn direction. So, it takes a little bit of time or a little bit of practice in deciphering, okay, circle north, so they want me to go here. That spatial orientation, I want to see you be able to do that, because that's how ATC is going to give you circling instructions. All right, demonstrate SRM. That's valid. We need to do that for the whole thing, but definitely during a circle. Establish the approach landing configuration, maintain stabilized approach and descent rate that ensures arrival at the MDA or prescribed circling altitude at or above or just above the MDA prior to the missed approach point. Skill 5, maintain airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, heading plus or minus 10 degrees, and altitude plus 100 minus 0 until descending below the MDA or pre-selected circling altitude above the MDA. So basically maintain at or above MDA until you're ready to descend on the final approach and land. Visually maneuver to a base or downwind leg appropriate for the landing runway and environmental conditions. Skill 7, if missed approach occurs, turn in the appropriate direction using the correct procedure and appropriately configure the airplane. So let's talk about that. A missed approach from a circling to land maneuver can be really confusing because by definition you're circling, well, in almost all cases you're circling to a different runway from which you shot the approach to. The one exception would be if it's called a circling approach because it's just too far off the center line of that runway. So it's sort of a straight-in approach, but you're just coming in at an angle. In that case, it's a little bit easier. But in most cases, what we're doing is we've got, let's say, an east-west runway. The wind is favoring that we land on let's say, runway 25. And so we don't have an approach that goes in a runway 25. So we shoot an approach to 7, and then we circle, kind of enter a downwind to land on runway 25. So in that case, we're landing on runway 25. We've made that turn, so now we're headed westbound, and we have to go missed. Well, the missed approach procedure is assuming that we're going eastbound. So we have to kind of have this in our mind. Again, it's all about spatial orientation here, is during the approach, and this needs to be part of your at least self-brief of, hey, if I have to go missed at any portion, here's my plan. I'm going to maneuver over maybe to the south and continue a 270-degree turn or 360-degree turn, depending on where the missed approach happens, to turn back to the missed approach course and do that. So that can be a real challenging thing to do, is going missed from a circling approach. So that's skill 7. Skill 8, if landing, initiate a stabilized descent, touch down on the first 1/3 of the selected runway without excessive maneuvering, without exceeding normal operating limits of the airplane, and without exceeding 30 degrees of bank. So that is a bank limitation that we have in the circling maneuver. It's not some Hayaka crazy approach, less than 30 degrees of bank maneuvering to make it happen. If you need more than 30 degrees of bank, it's probably time to do a missed approach. Or you need to go wings level, give yourself more spacing, and then go back in. But keep in mind, you have to maintain inside of that circling maneuver airspace, which I'm probably going to use the MFD, or I'm going to have my iPad configured to give me the distance from the end of the runway to make sure you're within the appropriate circling radius. And use every bit you have. That's a real common error that I see in circling maneuvers, is we're trying to do it too close to the runway. If you have 1.3 miles or 2 miles of circling criteria, it kind of depends on where you're at and what approach you're doing, because we have those new alternate circling radii. But anyway, if you have 2 miles, then use 2 miles, or use up to, don't go beyond it, but use as much as you can. Don't use 1 mile because you're trying to be safe, because that could actually have the opposite effect. You're too close, and you have to exceed that 30-degree bank angle, and that's when things start getting real dangerous in a circling approach, is when you're doing extreme maneuvering close to the ground at slow airspeeds. That can cause a stall. All right, landing from an instrument approach. This is our shortest one so far. We've got 2 knowledge items, 3 risk management items, and then 5 skills. So airport signs and markings, that's the knowledge area. So I call it paint, pavement, or lights. That's generally what we need to see to descend below MDA or decision altitude. So knowing what paint, pavement, and lights count, and being able to correctly analyze those. Risk management, attempting to land from an unstable approach. Again, I call it not calling the baby ugly. If you are trying to save a bad, unstable approach and turn a landing out from that, this is just multiple bad decisions that lead to a bad outcome. So just if it's unstable, go around, go missed approach. We need to see a missed approach anyway during this check ride. It doesn't mean an automatic failure, and that's happened more than once where an applicant's afraid that if they go missed approach, they just know it's going to be a failure, so they're going to try everything they can to save this approach, and it's just looking terrible. And that's a bad line of decision making. That shows me that you need a little more development in your aeronautical decision making, and you might not be ready to go out and fly instruments. So if the approach is ugly or unstable, just go around. That's a great decision making. That's what I want to see. Flying below the glide path, not great. Do not go below glide path. I talked about before about, well, what if you go full scale deflection above? Well, that's something that can be recovered from. If you go full scale deflection below the glide path, that is a automatic, you tie my hands, I cannot let you recover from that. That's a disapproval. Full stop. If you go full scale deflection below glide path, that is dangerous. That means you could have impacted terrain, because once you're full scale deflection, you have no idea how far below glide path you are. You just know that you're beyond full scale deflection, which means you could be impacting terrain. So that is not acceptable. Do not go below the glide path. That includes when you break out on an instrument approach, and now you have the visual glide slope indicator, your VASIs or PAPIs. If we get 4 red on the PAPIs after we've done beautiful ILS all the way down, and then you go full red trying to land on the first inch of the runway, that's grounds for disapproval too. In the airline world or the Air Force world, that's called a duck under, and that's probably a really quick way to get a discussion that you don't want to have with the chief pilot of why did you duck under on the visual glide slope indicator. So don't just follow the glide slope on the instrument procedure and then continue to follow the instrument glide slope when your visual glide slope is telling you something else. Let's talk about that real quick, because here at Russellville, we have kind of the opposite thing happening, where your instrument glide slope, it's a LNAV plus V, so it's just kind of an advisory glide slope, brings you down to MDA. When you reach MDA and see the VASIs or the PAPIs actually show you 4 red. So you actually need to descend down to MDA, then level off, capture the visual glide slope, and then follow the visual glide slope down. If you don't do that, you're going to get really close to terrain here at the end of runway 25. So that's a great example of how flying below the glide path is not just talking about the instrument glide path, it's also talking about the visual glide path when you break out. Transitioning from instruments to visual reference for landing. Again, kind of directly tied to what we just talked about there in risk management too. So let's get to our skills. Skill 1, transition from DA to MDA or visual descent point to a visual flight condition, allowing for safe visual maneuvering for normal landing. Got it, pretty self-explanatory. Skill 2, adhere to ATC or evaluator advisories such as NOTAMs, wind shear, wake turbulence, runway surface, braking conditions, or other appropriate considerations. Got it? Skill 3, complete the appropriate checklist. Makes sense. Skill 4, maintain a positive airplane control throughout the landing maneuver. Got it? And then demonstrate SRM, skill 5. Got it. Now, I've been talking a lot about checklists, but on landing from an instrument approach, again, single pilot IFR, if you're doing an ILS, you break out at 200 feet and you decide that's the appropriate time to pull out the before landing checklist because you're about to land, then you probably need to rethink your life. That's not a great time to run a checklist. So complete the appropriate checklist is not the same as use the appropriate checklist. Completing the appropriate checklist might be, I'm going to go to my final landing configuration. So if that's our Cessna example, I tracked 15 degrees flaps at the final approach fix, then I'm going to wait until I break out and landing's assured. Now I'm going to go full flaps. That may be the way that I fly this approach. So that's the last piece of the checklist that I need to complete. I don't necessarily need to pull out a physical checklist and look at that when I'm so close to the ground just after breaking out of the clouds there. So again, this would be a great time I'm going to run my before landing checklist prior to the FAF and then make note and then have some sort of reminder of if I've completed it or not. An example of this is switch positions. Most airplanes will have some switch that you can delay in turning on until a checklist is complete. This is what I do in almost every airplane that I fly. I love 3-position switches. So, for instance, a cow flap maybe that has a extend position, a retract position, and a neutral position. So I'm going to use that as my reminder of the before landing checklist is complete. So I've got gear down, flaps 50. I want to land at flaps 100, but I know that I'm not at flaps 100, one, because my flaps aren't full, but the other thing is I'm looking at that switch and it's still in the retract position. I'm only going to move it to the neutral position after I've completed the checklist. So me personally, what I typically do is when I break out, when landing's assured, I'll run one more. For me, what I'll do is I'll run one more checklist, and I call it a safety check. And flaps, gear, lights, pressures, pumps is kind of typically what I do. Flaps, gear, lights, pumps, pressures. So flaps, gear, lights, pressures, or pumps, depending on if I'm flying a plane that needs fuel pumps on. And pressures, I'm checking either hydraulic pressure if the plane's equipped with hydraulic pressure and a way to monitor it, or I'm just checking pressure that I do have brake pressure, so I know that I'm going to have brakes when I land. But that's kind of my last safety check. And I'll generally say runway clear, cleared to land. Because that's the other last thing is, did ATC or did tower give me permission to land? Is the runway clear? So flaps, gear, lights, pumps, pressures, runway's cleared, we're cleared to land, safety checks complete. That's kind of my personal checklist that I do at minimums, and I think everybody should practice something akin to that. All right, so that is our skills for the instrument approach. I think next we're going into emergency operations. And we're already probably right at an hour, so this is the longest podcast. Sorry, but this is a really important part of the instrument ACS. So our emergency operations, loss of communications. We have one knowledge item, so procedures to follow in the event of lost communications at various phases of flight, including techniques for reestablishing communication, when it is acceptable to deviate from an IFR clearance, and when to begin approach at the destination. So loss of communications is a required scenario that I give you as an examiner, and I really focus, I think the weak area is right here, reestablishing communications. Everybody knows that this is going to be tested, so as soon as I give a hint of a comm failure, everybody goes to the transponder, they squawk lost comm, they rattle off, all the clearances that they're allowed to go. They do all of that immediately, and it's like such a checkrideism, because in the real world, when you lose comms, the first thing you need to do is try to figure out why you lost comms and see if you can fix it. So don't go directly to, oh, he's testing me on lost comms. Here's the lost comm procedures. This isn't an oral exam. This is a practical exam. So practically, if you lose comms in the airplane, what are you going to do first? If you're by yourself, the last thing you're going to do is rattle off the requirements of, filed, cleared, whatever. You're not going to do that first. You're going to try to reestablish communications. So the first thing I'd like you to do is start a little bit of troubleshooting of, okay, well, is my volume off? Did I unplug my headset? Does my push-to-talk not work? Did this radio go out? Maybe I can try my second radio. If my second radio doesn't work, do I have any other form of communication? Do I have a handheld radio? Could that potentially work? Then once I've ruled out all of that stuff, then I'm going to squawk lost comm, and I'm going to start following my procedures here. The other thing to think about is a common reason for a lost comm is an electrical failure. So now you've got this whole other scenario to deal with that's probably a lot more critical than just a lost comm. You don't have any electrical system. So an electrical failure will cause a loss of communications. It will also cause drastically different decision making, because with a full electrical failure, you're probably not going to be able to successfully fly an instrument approach. In fact, you're not going to be able to successfully fly an instrument approach. So you've got a whole other slew of things that you need to start considering. So that's real common, the lost comm procedure, where people just have that rote memory of, oh, this is what the examiner expects me to know. No, I expect you to have that little bit higher level of decision making and figure out, well, first of all, how do I diagnose a lost comm, or how do I fix this lost comm? And then we're going to talk about the decisions you do after you verified that you did lose communications. So recognize simulated loss of comm, that's skill one. Simulate actions required to reestablish communications. That's the one that people screw up the most. Skill 3, determine whether to continue flight, flight plan destination, or deviate. Okay. And then skill 4, determine an appropriate time to begin the approach. All right, so those are our skills for lost comm. The next ones, I'm going to save these for our multi-engine discussions that we're going to have at a later date, but I'm going to assume that you're doing your instrument approach in a single-engine aircraft. So this does not apply to single-engine aircraft, just multi-engine aircraft for both tasks B and C. All right, task D is approach with loss of primary flight instrument or indicators. So this is our partial panel emergency. So for this, we have 2 knowledge items. So recognize if a primary flight instruments are inaccurate, inoperative, and advise ATC or the evaluator. So that's our first knowledge item. Knowledge 2 is common failure modes of vacuum and electrical attitude instruments and how to correct and minimize the effect of their loss. We have 3 risk management items. So failure to maintain airplane control, use of secondary displays if primaries have failed, and then we have our 3 skill areas. So skill 1, advise ATC or the evaluator if unable to comply with the clearance. Skill 2, complete a non-precision instrument approach without the use of the primary flight display, flight instruments using the skill elements of the non-precision approach task. See area of operation task 6 or operation task 6, task A, and then demonstrate SRM. So for our partial panel approach or our loss of primary flight display, the ACS says it's going to be the non-precision instrument approach. And then we're going to do it without the primary flight instruments. And we're going to demonstrate it in accordance with the skills listed of the non-precision approach skills. So like we talked about earlier, the first thing we talked about in the podcast or this series was the instrument and the non-precision instrument approach. So we're going to do it to that standard using only our partial panel. So the first thing I'll talk about here on the skill 1 is advise ATC if unable to comply with the clearance. So this is a real thing, and this is kind of subjective, and it's up to you as the applicant. But if you feel that you can't comply with that, then you need to fess up and tell ATC, hey, I'm partial panel. I really don't want short vectors. In fact, I want long vectors, and maybe I don't even want that approach. I want this approach over here at another airport. But show me, the examiner, that you're using that higher level of thinking and be able to analyze and say, hey, I can't comply with what you just asked me to do because I'm basically an emergency aircraft. One thing that I like to talk about with loss of primary flight controls, primary flight instruments, is that it is often not as obvious as what we experience in training environment. In the training environment, you have your instructor over there. They slap a sticky note over the PFD, and well, the PFD's failed. Well, in the real world flying, if you have a loss of vacuum pressure, your attitude indicator is not going to put a sticky note on itself. It's going to appear to keep working, and that's actually pretty dangerous because as it appears to keep working, it will start to spin down and drift and slowly indicate a turn. So you're going to initiate a turn to try to correct the incorrect attitude indicator, and eventually you're going to find yourself in an unusual attitude, and this one instrument that you've conditioned yourself to trust wholly during the past months of training is now lying to you, and that's very dangerous, and it's caused many accidents. So I actually carry sticky notes with me all the time, not because I'm a mean CFII and DPE. It's because if I have a real instrument failure, I'm going to take a sticky note out and I'm going to cover it up. Because if I have an actual vacuum failure, I want to cover up my vacuum instruments because I know that they're fixing to start lying to me, and I just want to cut them out of my life. I don't want to pay attention to them. I'm going to start immediately doing my secondary scan and not allow those instruments to start lying to me. So that's just kind of a side note on how I'm going to handle a real world failure like that. All right, we're at our last area of operation, post-flight procedures, and it's only has one task, task A, checking instruments and equipment. And the only skill is conduct a post-flight inspection, document discrepancies, and servicing requirements, if any. And we have one skill and one risk management item. So this is an easy one. You know I'm going to ask about all these. Functionality of installed equipment, navigation equipment, failure to perform proper post-flight, document airplane discrepancies, and then the one skill. So we're going to finish up the check ride with that. So we've gone through each and every task associated with the instrument approach or the instrument airman certification standards. And you might think we're done. Well, and this podcast is going really long, but we're not done yet. So hang with me just for a few more minutes. We're going to talk about something really important with the Instrument ACS, and that is our table of or our appendices. And specifically, we're going to talk about Appendix 7. So for some reason this says quit. Well, it's because I'm right there. I don't need that. Bear with me just for a moment here. Okay, let's go to our table of contents, our Appendix 7. I have a link for that specifically. And this is Appendix 7, Aircraft Equipment, Operational Requirements and Limitations. So it starts out talking about what your aircraft is required to have, what your equipment requirements are, which are all really important. The navigation, where I'm interested in is the amplifying remarks it gives on specific areas of operation. So the first one is Area of Operation 5, Navigation Systems. And it says, while the applicant is expected to be able to fly DME arcs, they may be selected for testing only if they are charted and available. So that just tells me the DME arcs are listed specifically, but I don't have to test you on those if they're not available. So you need to be able to fly them, but we may not fly them for the check ride. Instrument approach procedures, Area of Operation 6. This gives a lot of amplifying remarks, and it starts with stabilized approach criteria. So a stabilized approach is characterized by a constant angle, constant rate of descent, approach profile, ending near the touchdown point where the landing maneuvers begin. So that kind of gives a general definition of stabilized approach. Use of RNAV or GPS system. This is really important here. If the practical test is conducted in an airplane equipped with an approach-approved RNAV or GPS system or flight simulator training device that is equipped to replicate an approved RNAV or GPS system, the applicant must demonstrate approach proficiency using that system. If the applicant has contracted for training in an approved course that includes GPS training and the airplane FSTD has an appropriately installed operational GPS, the applicant must demonstrate GPS approach proficiency. All that's saying is if you come to the check ride with an airplane that has an approved GPS device on it for approaches, that you are going to have to fly a GPS approach. So don't think that you can just say, well, I wasn't trained on how to use a GPS, so I'd like to do all ground-based navigation. That's not going to fly. All right, localizer performance with vertical guidance, LPV minimums. Localizer performance with vertical guidance, LPV minimums, with the decision altitude greater than 300 feet height above touchdown may be used as a non-precision approach. However, due to the precision of its glide path and localizer-like lateral navigation characteristics, an LPV minimums approach can be used to demonstrate precision approach proficiency if the decision altitude is equal or less than 300 feet height above touchdown. So that is a really important point. That means we don't have to fly an ILS during our instrument check ride. We can fly an LPV approach, but, and this is a big but, the decision altitude of that LPV minimum must be below 300 feet HAT. So there are several LPVs, in my local area that have height above touchdown. Their minimums are greater than that. And then maybe you break out at 350 feet above the ground or 400 feet above the ground. So those wouldn't count. We could use those for non-precision, but we couldn't use them for precision. Vertical or lateral deviation standard. The standard is to allow no more than 3/4 scale deflection of either the vertical or lateral deviation during the final approach. As markings on flight instrumentations vary, a 3/4 scale deflection of either vertical or lateral guidance is deemed to occur when it is displayed 3/4 of the distance that it may be deflected from the indication representing that the aircraft is on the correct flight path. So it's just saying that there's not a standard 3/4 scale deviation marking on all instrument or all CDIs. So it's just saying, hey, we're talking about when it's displaced 3/4 of the distance it may be displaced. That's what we're talking about. Non-precision approach. The evaluator will select non-precision approaches representative of the type the applicant is likely to use. The choices must use at least 2 different types of navigational aids. So this is another really important point that might change in the future. The reason I say this might change is I'm seeing more and more aircraft that are being flown, especially experimental aircraft, that do not have traditional navigational equipment. They don't have a VOR, they don't have an ILS. They just have maybe 2 GPS units. They can only fly GPS approaches. So if right now you can't do a check ride in a plane that's equipped like that. You can't, because it says the choices must use at least 2 different types of navigational aids. And so if you only have GPS, there's no way you can successfully do this task. Now, most certified aircraft still have traditional ground-based navigational equipment on board. So in that case, we're going to have to do, and remember it says we have to, if it's equipped with GPS, we have to do a GPS approach. And if it's equipped and our 2 non-precision approaches, or we have to select 2, and they have to be different navigational aids. So this next paragraph just talks about all the different types of non-precision approaches. But it goes on to say the applicant must accomplish at least 2 non-precision approaches in simulated or actual weather conditions. One must include a procedure turn, or in the case of a GPS approach, a terminal area arrival procedure. At least one must be flown without the use of the autopilot and without the assistance of radar vectors. The yaw dampener and flight director are not considered parts of the autopilot for the purpose of this task. And then one is expected to be flown with reference to backup or partial panel instrumentation or navigation display, depending on the aircraft's instrument avionics configuration, representing the failure modes most realistic for the equipment used. So that's just saying our partial panel is kind of subjective, and it can change depending on how the aircraft is equipped. That's another one that I found challenging in all glass aircraft, is really what's a realistic way to give a partial panel. The G1000 has a handbook for examiners and instructors on how to kind of demonstrate this, but it's still kind of a challenge, and you might get, results might vary depending on the examiner that you use and depending on the instrument instructor that you use. So these remarks here tell us that we have to do 1 GPS non-precision, we have to do 1 non-GPS approach, and that's if your plane is equipped with GPS, but we have to do 1 of each. One has to be flown without using the autopilot. 1 has to be flown full procedure, but that could just be the TAA, right? We don't necessarily have to do a procedure turn. And then 1 is flown partial panel. The evaluator has the discretion to have the applicant perform a landing or a missed approach at the completion of each non-precision approach. Okay, so we can do either a missed or a landing. And then task B, precision approach. The applicant must accomplish a precision approach to the decision altitude using aircraft navigational equipment for centerline and vertical guidance in simulated or actual conditions. Acceptable instrument approaches for this part of the practical test are the ILS and GLS. In addition, if installed, the equipment and database is current and qualified for IFR flight, and approaches to LPV minima approach can be flown to demonstrate precision approach proficiency if the LPVDA is equal to or less than 300 feet height above touchdown. We already talked about this, but it reiterates that we can use an LPV approach to count for our precision approach if the height above touchdown is less than 300 feet. This has caused a lot of confusion because people understand that RNAV approaches are not precision approaches, and while that's legally true, the ACS allows us to use the LPV approach to demonstrate proficiency for a precision approach, and I think that just makes sense. That has greatly reduced the time it takes to complete this check ride, because now we can do it at a non-towered field that just has RNAV approaches and maybe a VOR nearby, we don't have to fly somewhere to find an ILS, which the ILSs are getting harder and harder to find, especially kind of in rural America where we don't have a lot of Class Charlie, Class Delta airports that are normally the airports with ILSs. So instead of having to fly an hour away to get an ILS, we can just do the RNAV approach here and call it good. So that helps out a great deal. The evaluator has the discretion to have the applicant perform a landing or a missed approach from the completion of a precision approach. So that's that, and that's Appendix 7. So I think I covered everything in Appendix 7. Those amplifying remarks are really important to kind of have the whole picture of the instrument ACS. We'll call it quits. I didn't go quite an hour and a half. That's good. Hopefully y'all hung with me here on this longer podcast, but we finished the Instrument Airman Certification Standards. So what you can look forward to in the next episodes, next 2 episodes probably at least, are some amplifying remarks on the instrument checkride, and not just the instrument checkride, but just instrument flying in general. So what I plan on doing is how to prepare your iPad for the instrument checkride. That is something that I think is important. So that's up next. The one after that, I would really like to hear from you as the listeners on what questions you have on the Instrument Airman Certification Standards. If you're coming up on your instrument checkride and have a question, or if you've taken your instrument checkride recently and want to make some, maybe I made some mistakes here. Maybe you had an experience that I didn't explain fully here. So I'd like to hear back from you on the episodes here in the next few weeks that I do. Sorry for the delay on this one. It was a little delayed getting this one out. I had COVID, had to recover from that. Then I had a trip out to California. So it's just been a really busy January for me, and I was a little late getting this one out, but I appreciate you waiting, and I so appreciate you watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast, and I would ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, tell your friends about it. If you're an instructor, tell your students about it. I'm very confident that listening to this type of content is going to give you more confidence going into your check ride, which is the real goal here. I want to give you confidence. I want to help you do better at that check ride. I want to help you be a safer aviator. And I think in preparing for that check ride, that's part of that. That's going to make you a safer aviator overall. And that just shows that you're going out there and seeking things that are going to help you be better, which I think is good. So thanks again, and I will see you next time.